Hi everyone, my name is Mason and I work for Comet Backup here in New Zealand. Welcome along to the Adrastea release webinar. I'm here to talk for about half an hour about our latest software release, what we've been working on, and all of the new and exciting changes from the last quarter. So I regularly run this webinar series. It showcases all of our latest and greatest new features Comet has to offer. And if you count the whole webinar series, this is episode 26. We used to run these webinars every month, but at the start of last year, 2022, we switched to publishing a monthly blog post about what's new. And this info webinar series now runs once a quarter related to these major quarterly software releases. But regardless of what our schedule is, it's all on the website. It's all on the webinar platform. You can subscribe to notifications about when we go live. And I'm coming to you live today. It's 9 a.m. here in New Zealand. And after this webinar, we will upload the recording to our YouTube channel. So if you're watching this on YouTube, then hi, hope the future's cool. And if you're watching this live, then thank you very much for making the time slot and coming along. And as a special thank you for being here live with me today, there is a chat widget in the bottom right corner of the screen. And you can click the button to pop it open. And if you have any questions as we go, just write them in and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. So as I mentioned, my talk this morning will probably be about 30 minutes long, and that's including some time for those questions at the end. About 30 minutes, maybe a bit more this time, I think, but everyone's busy, so I'll try and keep to that schedule. So I hope you got a coffee, get settled, and I'll just press on with things. So as you've seen from the title, today I'm going to talk about the Comet 23.8 Adrastea, our latest and greatest software release version. So the 23.8, it's the year and the month. So we release new Comet versions every week under the Voyager release track, and then every quarter, 4 times a year, we take all of that regular Voyager development and roll it up into these quarterly milestone releases, and that's your sort of fixed point to build on, offer to your customers. We put it on Comet hosted, we'll support it with patches and in the tickets, and another quarter's just flown by, really. And today I'm just going to recap all the new things you can expect when upgrading to Adrastea. So what you're seeing here in this picture, this is Jupiter. This is a photo taken by the brand new James Webb Space Telescope, and the photo was taken in August last year. The color looks different because this is a kind of infrared camera, which means you can just make out Jupiter's very faint rings. And if you look very closely, this bright spot orbiting just at the edge of the main ring is Adrastea. So Adrastea is very close to Jupiter. It's the second closest moon. It's a little bit wild. It's look how close it is already, but believe it or not, there's another moon even closer in. And it's probably related to the rings. In collision, it will contribute more mass to the rings. And last thing to say about Adrastea is that, like all moons of Jupiter, it takes its name from an ancient Greek mythological figure. Jupiter is what the Romans called Zeus, and Adrastea was Zeus's foster mother. And so we've been using these space-based code names for all of our quarterly releases for a long time. We've been using moons of Jupiter for the last few releases. We started out the very early versions of Comet with Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, and so on, and we're up to these moons. But enough about the name. What about the features? So we've counted 7 features and 24 enhancements this quarter for Adrastea. And the full changelog is available on our website in the release notes section. And today I'll just walk you through some of the main ones, starting off with this. This is a picture that says 1,000 words. And that's right, it is a new refreshed design for the Comet Backup desktop app. So we're very pleased to announce a visual refresh for the desktop app. Last quarter, we had introduced a brand new design for Comet Server, the Comet Server web interface, and we're following up this quarter with the desktop app. So this is the first major visual layout change to the desktop app in, I think, all Comet's history. The current desktop apps had the same layout for the past 6 years. So our goal for the new interface design was to make the product simpler for new users while still keeping it familiar for existing users. So you'll see the tabs, icons, buttons, fonts, and colors have all been refreshed with a modern, sort of more rounded style, but you're still greeted with your familiar protected items and charts on the home screen. So the most fundamental change was really to navigation within the app. So the previous, we used to have this left side navigation bar, that's been removed, which means your protected items are always clearly visible. and we've refreshed this breadcrumb bar to help orient you to it as a landmark. So the left side navigation bar has been removed. It's been replaced with this top navigation bar, which puts more emphasis on your brand logo. And it offers clearer, more distinctive focus on these call to action buttons for the key backup and restore functionality. If you're using a custom help frame, it gets embedded into this area here, and the help button is, well, it's behind this drop down. Sorry about that. So let's talk about this drop down. There's a new drop down menu in this top right corner, and it's using that modern sort of 3 dots icon style, which everyone knows what it means instantly. And inside this menu, you get quick access to activity to see your job history, creating recovery media for restoring disk image backups, and a new settings dialog. So the new settings dialog contains the storage vault management, as well as account and login settings, email reporting settings, your devices, the ability to import settings from other supported backup products. So most of the design changes happened on that main screen. There are a few cases where we dove in deeper, in particular to the schedule dialog. And so the schedule dialog has also been rearranged to put all of the important sort of commonly used settings on the front tab and move all of the less commonly used advanced settings onto the back tab. So this removes a few clicks for setting up the time of a scheduled backup job. So it's not only visually simpler, it's also easier to use because we've gotten rid of some of the clicks here. So this new interface is available today in Comet 23.8 Adrastea. So please install the update, check it out, and let us know in the support tickets if you have any feedback. But that's not all. There's lots of other new features this quarter. Next, I'd like to take a look at admin single sign-on with OAuth. So Comet Server has supported, let me rephrase that. Comet Server has added support for administrators to single sign-on, or SSO, to the Comet Server web interface using a supported OAuth identity provider or OpenID Connect. What you really need to know is it's how these login with buttons work. So Comet has long supported single sign-on for admins using the classic LDAP protocol, like for on-prem Active Directory. But this new feature extends that with various what's called identity providers, or IDPs, that use the OAuth standard. And most notably, this includes Entra ID, formerly known as Azure ID until a few weeks ago. And this is the one that you get with an Office 365 tenant as well. We also support login with Google. To be more specific, that can be Google Cloud, Google Workspace, or a personal Google account. And also any other OIDC compatible provider that uses something called a discovery document, which is 99% of them, including Keycloak if you're self-hosting an identity server. And I think Duo and Okta might fall into this category as well. If you want to set this up, log in with my central identity provider. There's a few steps involved, but they're basically the same for Comet as they are for any other federated login system. So if you've ever had to set up OAuth login for any other systems, then Comet's way of doing it will look pretty familiar. You start off in the Comet Server web interface. You go Settings, Admin Accounts, and click the External Authentication Sources button, and it will bring up a dialog full of settings about how to set it up. We've got full details in the documentation. I'm just going to give a quick high-level overview now because there's a few parts of this that are really quite interesting. First of all, near the top, you can pick a Comet tenant. So this feature can work with sub-tenants if you're using that to separate out resellers or business divisions within your Comet server. And then there's all the stuff about how you connect to your identity provider. When you're using this, say you click, login with Azure or whatever, and it bounces you back and forth from Comet to Azure and back to Comet until both sides agree that you are logged in. And in the back end, in the settings, it's a bit the same. First of all, you go visit Azure's settings page, register a new Azure app, copy those credentials to this settings page, and then you need to filling in these client ID, client secret fields, and then you copy this redirect URI field back into the Azure settings page, and that way that bounce back and forward will work properly. Next field here is skip double 2FA. So Comet Server supports its own two-factor authentication, but if you're using login with Azure and you have two-factor on Azure, then do you really need Comet Server doing it as well? So if you check this box, it can skip over the Comet side of two-factor for users who successfully do the Azure side of it. And scopes and claims. Say you want to do, log in with Office 365, but only some of the staff should have access. How do you solve that? Is you request an extra scope. So for instance, there's a Microsoft intra scope. So if you're present in a certain security group, then you can require that the scope claims to have a certain value. Like, yes, Azure claims that my account is present in the group. And if the claim doesn't match, then you get to learn the difference between authentication and authorization. You might be authenticated as that user, but that user is definitely not authorized. So Comet Server won't let that person log in. So that's an important one. And lastly, if you get all of this right, the bouncing login, the two-factor, checking your groups, then it creates a new Comet Server admin account for you on demand, or it uses one from last time. And just like with our existing LDAP feature, you can specify which Comet Server permissions are granted to the newly generated account. And this new account is marked as externally managed within the admin accounts table. So this person will always need to log in with this as your source to access this account. So that's it, OAuth logins for your Comet server. There's one more part to it, which I briefly want to touch on, which is that in Comet 23.8 Adrastea, we expanded the set of available admin permissions quite a lot. There's now many more restrictions and capabilities that you can put on these admin accounts. And this applies both for OAuth and also just in general for admin accounts. These new permissions are available, and you can restrict that admin's ability to use different storage types, view server history and info, and so on. As a quick interlude, OAuth single sign-on and these admin permission restrictions actually were both requested by partners on our feature voting page. If you haven't seen this system before, it's available from the resources menu on the account.cometbackup.com system. You can request new features or upvote features that other people have requested. And if you upvote or comment on a feature, you'll get notified when the feature is completed or if there's any major news with it. So it's a great way to get notified when new features are available. And we do look at the system often. We do develop ideas from in here. And when I looked at this yesterday, we were up to 155 completed features. So we look at the system pretty often to help guide and prioritize what we should be developing next. It's not the only thing we base our decision making on, but it does play an important part. So please check it out. Here's another feature we completed this quarter that was also a highly upvoted feature request. Policy linked protected items. So Comet supports user policies that you can assign to users, and a policy is sort of like a group of settings that applies to, well, you can then apply it to a whole set of users at once. And so one of the available policy settings that you can configure is something called default protected items. We've had this feature for a few years now, and the way it works is in the policy for some user, you set up default protected items. And when a new device comes along, that device gets a copy of the default protected items. They're just in there by default. And now the fact that they're copied in is an important point, because after they're copied in, they're decoupled. And changing the policy protected item doesn't change the user's protected item, because that was just a default. And we heard from the feature voting system and from our market analysis and talking to partners that there's a few different use cases for this feature. If you're really thinking of a default, like backing up the Windows users folder, sure. Create a protected item that by default backs up C drive/users, and customers will probably change it, and that's fine. But there's another use case, which is when you have targeted settings. So say I'm backing up, I don't know, Cool App version 5, and it stores all of its files in C drive/Cool App 5. And then one day Cool App 6 comes out, and I need to upgrade hundreds of protected items to point to C drive/Cool App 6. So it would be really nice if the protected items stayed linked with that policy. It could just be changed in one place, and it would roll out to all of these users at once. These are two pretty different use cases. We acknowledge you might be in one or the other different situation. So we've added an option. When you create the policy default protected item, you can choose with the setting here to control if the protected items remain linked or not. So if they're linked, they remain coupled to the policy after they've been created. If you do check that box, the policy protected item will be synced to all users in that policy. It also means you will not be able to edit the protected item for the user because all of its settings are forced by the policy settings. So you have to change it in the policy instead, and then it will affect all users on the policy. So that's cool. Nice feature, now available in Comet 23.8 Adrastea, and thank you to everyone who upvoted this feature and left comments and suggestions about it. Comet 23.8 Adrastea has added support for WebDAV. WebDAV is another storage protocol like FTP, SFTP, or the S3 compatible protocol, and can be used to store files in a remote location. The protocol's been around since the 90s, and it's based on HTTP technology, which might have been a risky bet in the 90s, but it's absolutely paid off because WebDAV has gotten to take advantage of all of the time and effort that has been put into the HTTP ecosystem over the years, including SSL, HTTPS security, pipeline transfers, HTTP2, and so on. It's available for storage vaults and also for Comet Server storage role. And the settings for it are pretty simple. You need the URL of your WebDAV server, username and password. Putting in a subdirectory is optional. One click on the test connections button and you're ready to use it. So it's quite simple. Why did we add this? Comet supports a lot of storage backends and storage providers already. It's very flexible, and we're just sort of filling out the set. This is the last, I think, major basic supported protocol, and just making sure that Comet's comprehensive in what it supports. But other than that, WebDAV is actually really interesting. You could go your whole life without hearing about WebDAV, but at the same time, in some organizations, it's absolutely essential and widely used. And personally, I think that's partially because it's a built-in feature of Windows Explorer to access a WebDAV drive. And so a lot of companies will set up your sort of employee shared network storage is actually using the WebDAV protocol. And this is a Windows screenshot, but there's also built-in support in macOS and KDE and GNOME and other desktops. And because this capability for accessing remote storage is built into the operating system, don't need any extra software to access it, WebDAV is pretty simple to use, very low barrier to entry, and so it's got quite a broad user base amongst these sort of managed environments, enterprises, universities, and there's many commercial providers of WebDAV hosting too. Some of them are pretty well known. You might have heard of Hetzner, DreamHost, Yandex, pCloud, many others. I was doing some research for this presentation and for our documentation, and something interesting I discovered was Nextcloud has a built-in WebDAV server. If you haven't heard of Nextcloud, it's a sort of open source, self-hosted, sort of private Google Drive thing for photos and documents and groupware sharing between users. It's pretty comprehensive. What's interesting is there are commercial Nextcloud hosting services, and they're all WebDAV services. So take Hetzner, for example. They're a major cloud provider with servers in Germany and Finland. And they have a product called StorageBox, which supports FTP, SFTP, WebDAV, and it's cost effective, very cost effective. But as well as that, Hetzner also offers a thing called Storage Share, which is Nextcloud, so it's WebDAV based. And the price is similar to StorageBox at about €3 per terabyte. But for some reason, it has a higher connection limit than StorageBox and an unlimited number of private user credentials, which is exactly what you want in Comet for these, like a direct-to-cloud storage vault. You want each user to have their own private credentials. So that's one really interesting example. Ionos, they've got UK-based Nextcloud hosting, so WebDAV hosting, and this plan here is about £4.50 per terabyte. But you don't have to use a commercial provider. You can buy some hard drives, be the commercial provider yourself. You can host your own WebDAV storage quite easily because, well, it's built into Nextcloud, but it's also built into the Apache web server. There's a heap of Docker containers for it, and it's built into Windows Server. Inside IIS, there's a built-in WebDAV server. And there's lots of other easy self-service servers you can run. In particular, Synology. Synology on their NAS boxes have got a one-click server from the package center. And in fact, if you're storing data on a Synology NAS using SMB, using Windows Network Sharing, often managing passwords for that is kind of complicated for the way background service accounts work on Windows. So our support team will sometimes recommend enabling SFTP as an alternative on Synology. And now WebDAV is another alternative there. So that's WebDAV. Make of it what you will. It's probably not our top recommendation. We would still probably recommend S3 compatible with one of the major providers as your best bet. But it's very interesting to have this as an option in Comet, and I'm sure some people will get a lot of use out of it. Performance. So throughout the last quarter, during the previous 23.6 Voyager series, we had a major focus on performance. And as a result, there are 11 major changes for improved performance that are part of the 23.8 Adrastea release. Comet was already very efficient, so in order to improve the performance even more, we've been focusing on sort of a wide range of small wins, and from our user interface to our fundamental data structures. Everyone loves having more performance, so we're very excited to share this with you. Comet's been around for a few years, and we've already gotten the low-hanging fruit, the easy performance wins a long time ago. So the exact details about how we managed to achieve even more performance can be pretty technical, so I've summarized them into a few headlines. First of all, jobs start faster. The key improvement that you will likely notice applies to all jobs. After your next retention pass, jobs for that storage vault will get a noticeable improvement in the startup time. Great. And as well as this, we've made targeted improvements. So for instance, backup jobs now start faster. And one way we've achieved this is to remove a bottleneck related to scanning files for the progress bar. In most cases for incremental backup jobs, rather, we can come up with a good approximation for the progress bar very quickly. And as the backup job runs, that approximation can get more accurate, and by the end of the backup job, it's perfectly accurate. So this removes a whole phase at the startup of your backup job. So just making those backup jobs start faster. We also made restore jobs start faster. Previously, if you started a restore job remotely from the web interface, there was a small speed penalty to doing that, but we've raised it to have the same great startup performance as a desktop app. The desktop app is now much snappier at rendering large amounts of snapshots to pick between. Browsing data for granular restore from inside a disk image backup job is now quite a bit snappier. And looking a bit wider at the performance changes we've made this quarter, I want to talk a little bit about Comet's low RAM mode. So normally Comet uses a bit of RAM for deduplication. The exact amount varies quite a lot depending on how big your storage vault is. It's the primary driver of it. If you've got multiple terabytes inside your storage vault, Comet at every backup has to search through all of those chunks to see if it's already stored, so we can skip re-uploading it. And it works really well, but it does use a little bit of RAM. And for memory constrained devices like netbooks, Docker containers, NAS devices, if the memory isn't there, then you can't use it no matter what. So we've got this option, prefer temporary files instead of RAM slower option in Comet. And that's something you can use if you're finding Comet wants more RAM than you have available. It does make the job slower. I would hand wave, it makes it about 5 times slower. But suddenly the memory usage is constant, flat, a couple dozen megabytes. Like it's very low RAM. So in the latest Comet 23.8 Adrastea, we've extended this low RAM mode to also be available for restore jobs. That's not really a performance feature, but what is a performance feature is we've made the low RAM mode significantly faster thanks to a neat piece of tech called a Bloom filter. And this is sort of an 80-20 solution. For only a few megabytes of memory, we can recover a high fraction of the performance. So the low RAM mode is now quite a bit faster. It's still slower than full memory mode, but we're a few steps towards closing the gap. That's not all for performance. Comet supports restoring MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server databases straight back into the database server. And that's now quite a lot faster. Previously, we would read from the storage vault, right to the database, read from the storage vault, right to the database, and that's now double pumped in full duplex. And so we're continuously reading and writing in parallel there, filling up the duty cycle of those threads. So this will be particularly helpful if there's any latency from the storage vault or any latency to the database. Storage is faster. So Storage, they're one of our storage partners. They offer cloud storage at a very competitive price. They have a sort of globally distributed architecture. They've recently put some engineering time and effort into their connection protocol, and that work has landed as part of Comet 23.8 Adrastea, so a nice bonus for storage users. And the last point for performance, object lock retention passes are faster. So object lock, this is a new feature of some S3 compatible providers, including Amazon AWS and Wasabi and some others, where you can mark an object as locked and it becomes immutable. Nobody can delete or modify it, not even ransomware. So it's a great defense against ransomware, a great security feature. Comet has supported it for a while now, but in order to make it work with retention passes, where Comet really does want to delete some data, we have to do a bit of extra processing after each retention pass. So there was a small performance penalty involved here. But in our latest Comet 23.8 Adrastea release, that extra processing step is now much more optimized. So object lock performance is much improved. Moving on, Comet Server web interface. This is going to be a pretty quick slide because last quarter we debuted the major new redesign of the Comet Server web interface. It brought in this left-hand navigation bar, the refreshed widgets, colors, tables, and more. This quarter, we've just made lots of small improvements as usual. There's lots of small things that I'd like to highlight. First of all, the quick search finds more things. Before, you could hit the search bar and find users and protected items and settings pages, but now you can also find customers by email address, IDs, storage vaults, and jobs. So if you've got an email or an ID to paste in, that search bar will now be able to find it. We've also improved the look and feel of the quick search, and now you can use the keyboard to navigate through the results. It now more closely matches your custom branded colors. Aside from the quick search, there's a new account name column on the recent activity page. For those of you who use the account name column, just making sure it's visible if you want it. I think the column is off by default just for horizontal space reasons, but you can now enable it from the View Columns button, and it will be remembered by your browser once you do that. We've added live browse for more protected item types. So when you're setting up a protected item from the Comet Server web interface remotely for one of your end users, you can now remotely browse and configure application-aware writers, so that's custom VSS writer drivers, as well as Hyper-V virtual machines and Exchange Server EDB databases. So that makes it much easier to operate your business remotely without having to go on site or get a remote desktop session to the customer. A few more things have been added. Comet Server now tracks and remembers the operating system version for devices even after they go offline again. And this is so that we can show the operating system even when the device is offline. This is partially a requirement for the policy-linked protected item feature I talked about earlier, because you don't want to back up C drive/users on a Mac or var/lib on a Windows PC. And lastly, the settings page loads faster if you've got a lot of customized permission settings. All the permissions are loaded at once instead of one at a time. So this will have a great effect, particularly on if you've got an admin account with limited permissions or tenant admin accounts where those permissions really come into play. The settings page will now load faster for them. So that's the main changes in the Comet Server web interface this quarter. Just nice small additions to make your life easier and make the product more comprehensive. Laptops. So something has changed here that will probably affect you. So I'm going to tell this story from the beginning. Comet has long supported a run when PC starts option in the job schedule settings. And this option is highly useful for laptops that are often offline or sleeping. If you regularly schedule a backup job, but a laptop is often offline, it's, a regularly scheduled job is unlikely to occur at those, random odd moments when the device is online. And so by running a backup job immediately when the PC boots, the device is more likely to catch some successful backup jobs. However, recent versions of Windows have widely expanded how the fast startup and hybrid sleep are used. And so these days, a Windows laptop will often not really restart, but only sort of simulate a restart via hibernation-related techniques. And this has a negative effect on the run when PC starts option in Comet because it was only triggered via a full restart, which is not really the default behavior in current versions of Windows on modern laptops. So as a result, we have extended the run when PC starts option to now count waking up from sleep as starting the PC. And this is more in keeping with the behavior of sort of current generation laptop computers. It should make the option just work as expected in more use cases. Your end users will be affected by this. Compared to the old behavior, it's likely that, since we've changed what this checkbox does, it probably means additional backup jobs will run. But our expectation is that is probably a good thing. It's probably what you wanted all along. and so Comet will be more reliable overall, and hopefully we'll get a better chance at backing up these laptop devices that are often offline. macOS, this is another change that may affect your users. Until now, and in our previous quarterly release 23.5 Thebe, our minimum system requirements on Mac were for macOS 10.11, also known as El Capitan. That's a 2015 version of macOS, and there's been many more releases since then. In Comet 23.8 Adrastea this quarter, we are raising our minimum system requirement to macOS 10.13. So 10.11 and 10.12 are no longer supported. It's always unfortunate to drop support for old systems. It's not a decision we make lightly, but in this case, it shouldn't really be a problem for two main reasons. First of all, as you can see in the picture, we're talking about pretty old stuff. We're dropping the 8-year-old operating system and keeping the 6-year-old operating system. Apple put out a new one every year, so this is 6 behind. macOS is already up to version 14. Second of all, Apple is reasonably good about hardware support, so your macOS users with older Mac machines can just run the free update as long as their Mac isn't coming up on 15 years old, which, in the machines that I see day to day, these are pretty rare. If you are affected, if your Mac is 15 years old, older than 2009, and you can't upgrade it, I think this is pretty rare. But I do have hard numbers from our company statistics, and they do exist out there, in a few percent at least. So for those devices that are stuck on keeping an old version of macOS, it's easy. You just also have to keep an old version of Comet. So the previous quarterly version of Comet, 23.5 Thebe, will continue to work on these old macOS machines. And this only affects the Comet Backup client app, not the Comet Server, since Comet Server is only available for Windows and Linux. Latest code signing news. So this is going to be a little bit technical, but not to worry. This is my last slide for today. What is code signing? If you're using the default pre-built client with Comet Backup branding, you don't need to worry about this, and you can look at another browser tab for the next 3 minutes or so. But if you are custom branding the client installer, then what Comet Server does when you click the download button, generates a fully custom installer with all of your custom branding. And it's a very cool feature. But there's one catch. You are taking on the responsibility of shipping custom software, and that makes you a software developer. Congratulations. As a software developer, there's a couple things you have to know about not being lumped in as malware. A custom app, your branded version is different. Antivirus has never seen it before, and it wants to install a background service that encrypts files and uploads them to the internet. That's unfortunately pretty suspicious behavior. And probably you will get some warnings from Windows about being an untrusted app. Or if you're using a third-party antivirus, Bitdefender, something that's probably even more aggressive, but not to worry. There's a main fix for it, which is to buy in to the Microsoft Authenticode program and sign the app with your developer certificate. And likewise for the Apple developer program if you have Mac users. Comet makes it pretty easy. There's info in the docs. Our support team can help with the process. We've had code signing support for a long time. And I'm here talking today about our latest Comet 23.8 Adrastea release and just some of the technical changes that have happened to the code signing capability this quarter. First of all, looking at how Comet Server code signs the Mac client app. So the code signing system for signing your customized macOS backup client. And it can work in 2 ways. In the settings, this method option here. For a long time, the only possible way to perform code signing for Mac was on a real Mac. And so Comet worked by SSHing into your Mac and doing the signing there. Really complicated system. The change is to announce that because of changes Apple have made at their end, Comet 23.8 Adrastea, the SSH mode now requires your Mac machine to have Xcode 13 installed. Not too hard. Head over to your Mac, open the App Store, click to update Xcode. Should be pretty painless. But wow, it's really crazy to need a whole Mac machine sitting around for the occasional SSH signing. So about a year ago, we added this upload mode instead. Using a cross-platform toolchain, it's much simpler, no longer requires a real Mac sitting around. That's definitely our recommendation. If you're still using the SSH mode, give it a go, try migrate to this mode instead. A few other quick code signing changes to mention. If you're running Comet Server on Linux ARM64, like the AWS Graviton set of servers, they're available on Oracle Cloud, or any of these Ampere Ultra servers. They've been really popular recently. In the previous quarterly release, Comet 23.5 Thebe, we unfortunately had to put some restrictions on ARM Linux distro support. We could only support Codesigning, the Windows client, if you were running certain Linux distros, and I'm happy to report in Comet 23.8 Adrastea, we've won that fight, and Codesigning, the Windows client from a Linux server, now works on all distros again, regardless of whether they're glibc based or muzzle based distros. So that's great. The last thing to talk about is Windows. So when you buy a Codesigning certificate for Windows, you used to mostly work with these PFX files, PFX certificate files, or P12 files. And it turns out people's PFX files kept getting stolen, and malware was being signed with people's legitimate certificates, which sort of defeats the whole system. And as a result, it's now mandatory to use a more secure certificate storage format. In the last quarterly release, 23.5 Thebe, we added support for Azure Key Vault, which is a really cool cloud-based system for secure certificates. You can watch the previous quarterly webinar replay for more information about that. But prior to that, your only real option was these USB smart cards, that also called dongles. They'd get mailed to you by courier. It looks like a USB storage drive, but it's not. It's a special hardware device that can do certificates and private keys and hardware, and programs can talk to it using something called a PKCS11 driver. In Comet 23.8 Adrastea, we've really simplified how you use these devices. The settings are really simple. We've got guides on how you can use these GUI apps to browse the device, find the ID of the certificate, paste it into Comet, so it's very simple to use. The last point is that if your Comet server is running in the cloud on a VPS or an AWS or something where you can't easily plug in a USB device, one option is, as I mentioned, the Azure Key Vault support for using Azure-based tokens. But we've also recently tried out this app called Virtual Here, which forwards a USB device over the network or over the internet to another PC. And so that's a reasonably good solution for forwarding a USB device to a cloud server. So we shout out to Virtual Here for making a useful app. So we've been slightly with 37 minutes. That's all I have for today. Are there any questions? I can see there's a couple questions in already. But just to recap, I talked about a pretty whirlwind tour of some of the 7 features and 24 enhancements this quarter in our latest Comet 23.8 Adrastea release version, including the new desktop app interface. We've now got admin single sign-on with OAuth or OpenID Connect or Microsoft or Google for login with Microsoft. Extended admin permissions. There's now many more admin permissions. Reminder about the feature voting system. What else did I talk about? Protected items that can now stay linked with the policy. That's a great feature. WebDAV, the new storage type. It's built into Windows and also has lots of cloud providers available. Performance, and those 11 main performance improvements we made this quarter. I touched on the Comet Server web interface, minor improvements to quick search, the new columns. The when PC start option now also applies to when a PC wakes up from sleep. macOS, we unfortunately had to drop support for old versions of macOS. And code signing, just some small changes to code signing for macOS, Windows, and Linux. There's actually a few more things in the changelog this quarter that I didn't get a chance to talk about, and we're already pretty over time. There's been a lot of focus on diagnostics, improved error reporting. There are many improvements to our Office 365 backup support. We now better support file creation timestamps on Windows and so on and so forth. So if you want the full picture, then check out the release notes on our website at docs.cometbackup.com. Just to look at some of the questions. Any issues with Microsoft GCC platform in regards to the OAuth login support? I think it'll just work out of the box. I can't say I've tested it personally since I'm not eligible for the GCC platform, I don't think. But OAuth provider-wise, this is expected to work. Please raise a support ticket if you have any issues with it. We have another question. When performing a backup in low RAM mode, can you share how much slower it is compared to the full RAM mode? Before the enhancement, if it's 5 times slower, I'm excited to hear the rough estimate now with the enhancement. Thank you, Thanks for the question. The short answer is it depends on the makeup of the ratio to new chunks versus old chunks. And if you're doing a backup job entirely of new data, Comet will have never found those chunks before. And if you're doing an incremental backup of something you've just backed up, Comet will find every single one of those chunks before. And the Bloom filter gives you a nearly 100% speed up in the case where a chunk has not been seen before, and it has almost no effect in the case where the chunk has been seen before. So it really depends on the rate of change of data. There's quite a lot of variables involved. Unfortunately, I can't put a hard number on it, but basically for initial backups and new data, we have closed the gap entirely. And for existing backups, there will be less of an improvement. But overall, in every backup, a little bit changes. So it really depends on the rate of change of data within an incremental backup job. But a really interesting question. Thank you. There's another question here about checking free space. Takes quite a lot of time without any significant I/O. What exactly happens during this task and why is it performed? So Comet says checking free space. What it's really doing is measuring the size of files in the storage vault. And we measure the size of files in the storage vault for two reasons. One is so that we can actually report it, how big the customer's storage is so you can bill your customer properly. The other reason we measure the size of the storage vault is to enforce a storage vault quota if you have any storage vault quotas. And the reason it's slow is because, well, sometimes storage platforms are just slow at doing this. If you've ever gone into Windows, right-click your C drive, go Properties, let it spin for a while it counts all the files. Often it can take quite a long time to do that. Unfortunately, this phase is kind of necessary if you want to have any idea of how much data is inside that storage location. We've got some ideas to improve the performance here even further. But what I would recommend doing is trying to measure the size of that directory yourself using, you say this is MinIO S3 compatible backend. If you use the MinIO client or S3 client or a GUI app like CyberDuck and try and right-click the whole directory, go Properties on it, see how big it is. It should take roughly the same amount of time as Comet's measurement here, because that's all Comet's doing in this case. Any more questions? I'll just wait another minute. We have one more question. Is there a white paper about how encryption works that can be used to share with customers? We do have extensive details about the encryption in the documentation. It's not exactly in white paper format, but you're welcome to share it with customers as is. I would suggest sort of copying the information and branding it as your own sort of company. But in short, the encryption is actually good. It's genuinely strong. It's all AES zero knowledge keys. There's a pretty comprehensive diagram about how the encryption for storage vaults is tied to the user's password, which is tied to something. And as well as that, there's access gating on your storage layer. The storage vault encryption keys are designed with one particular property in mind, which is that funny thing about backup software, we do expect people's PCs to get lost, stolen, destroyed, wiped, ransomware, and so we can't rely on encryption material remaining on the customer's PC, because it's expected that that might disappear at any point in time. And so we want to store the storage vault encryption keys somewhere durable, somewhere safe, inside the user account profile on the Comet server. But at the same time, when we were designing Comet for the first time, we had some high security customer use cases in mind. We had some government and medical customers who didn't want the service provider to have access to the data, and so that was one of our use cases. This is something that we've seen both sides on for over the years. But we use what's called a zero knowledge ratchet, a ratchet like a one-way turning thing, to store the storage vault encryption keys in the Comet server, but sort of pre-ratcheted on the client side. And so even though the encryption key is stored inside the Comet server admin can't necessarily even look at it or use that key because it's zero knowledge encryption. So there's a fascinating diagram about it in the documentation. Another question here. Any plan for detecting encryption events that ransomware can create and flag it early on before all is lost? That's a great question. We do get asked this reasonably often, can we do ransomware detection? I realize some of our competitors do this. Looking at the way it works, some ransomware detection works by, did the file name change? Do you have all these .locky or .whatever files suddenly appearing? Or have you just got a massive change in the number of changed files, if there's an increase in the number of changed files? Comet doesn't really consider changed files because what Comet does is it scans the disk, backs up your files, and then stores them in a deduplicating store. And so whether a file is changed or not, Comet sort of figures that out based on whether the content, the content size has changed. So in terms of detecting sort of abnormal events, you would be looking for things like large upload sizes. If you do another backup job and suddenly there's a very large unexpected upload size, that would be an indication that files have changed unexpectedly. And if most of your files have changed, maybe ransomware changed them, maybe something else changed them. In terms of figuring out exactly or sort of productizing that feature, we feel it's a little bit going outside of our core competency. We really want to focus on backup as a service and sort of that sort of key data recovery, rather than branching out into what we think is a little bit unrelated area. But yeah, definitely it's possible to detect ransomware with Comet, but it's not exactly a built-in feature. It's a little bit outside our wheelhouse. One more question, follow up. I understand correctly that if I uncheck the admin can reset password, only the user can restore its data, not the admin, whatever. Yeah, it's I really recommend bringing up the diagram in the docs. If you head to docs.cometbackup.com and then click documentation, click the appendix, right at the top of the appendix page, there's a big diagram about how the encryption key material works. When you checkbox the admin can reset password, what it actually does is copies a recovery key into the Comet server's profile, and that recovery key can be used to decrypt secrets. And so it's not really a checkbox. It looks like a checkbox, but what it does is it controls the presence of additional encryption material server-side. So you can uncheck the box, but you can't check it again because you can't create this encryption material out of thin air. You can only create it based on knowledge of the customer's password, which is why you can checkbox it inside the client app, but in the server side, you can only uncheck it. Yeah, and once the Comet server has knowledge of this sort of recovery key encryption material, then it can do things like restore data, change the password, and do those sort of advanced things that you might expect. Whereas if you don't have the recovery key, you as the Comet server administrator are just completely locked out. So this is really a use case thing. Comet server it's a white label product. It's a lot of people rebrand it. It's used in a lot of different situations. Some people don't really mind. Some people are sort of high touch MSPs, you've got a good trust relationship with your customer, you're on the phone with them, they trust you, you're also providing other IT services. Of course, you're trusted to reset the password. Of course, the checkbox will be on. In fact, you can even set a policy setting so that it's always on. But then we've got, a broad, that's one sort of end of the spectrum of the range of Comet users. And at the other end, we've got high regulatory compliance organizations where the backup administrator has a certain amount of permission, but definitely not the permission to restore files, definitely not the permission to manage the keys. And so being able to uncheck that is actually important for sort of those security use cases. I hope that helps. Sorry, I think I was just rambling a little bit. Feel free to follow this up in a support ticket actually afterwards. Thanks everyone for all the questions. There were quite a lot of questions today. I think that's all the questions we have time for, but we do still want to hear from you. If you have any questions at all, we're always happy to help out. We're more than happy to hear your questions by ticket through the usual ticket system at account.cometbackup.com, or you can email us, hello@cometbackup.com, or did you know we do actually support phone calls? Now, our company is based in New Zealand. We do have international support teams for round-the-clock level 1 technical support. But if you want a sales call, or if you want any more advanced technical support or troubleshooting, we'll need to figure out a good time that suits both us in New Zealand and in your country. So in the Southern Hemisphere, we're still in our winter time, UTC plus 12, but we're about to go into our summertime, UTC plus 13. So just makes scheduling a little bit complicated, but still, all you have to do is go to the Comet website, and at the bottom of the page, you click Contact Us, and there's an option to schedule a phone call with a time zone widget showing our available times, and it will just work everything out for you. We're more than happy to jump on a call. Often that's a very quick way of clearing the air and getting answers to any questions you might have. So that's all from me. Hopefully you've managed to take away some useful information. So please check out the latest version of Comet 23.8 Adrastea. All users of the previous quarterly series, 23.5 Phoebe and earlier, you're encouraged to upgrade. We're happy for you to continue using older quarterly versions if you feel like it. Hope you're all keeping well and safe. And you can expect another webinar for the next quarterly release in 3 months' time. Cheers.